I'm sure everyone who's watching has been told by a teacher at some point that school has to prepare you for the real world, that it's about getting a good grade so that you can get a good job. I'm sure anyone who went to university has been asked loads of times, like, what job they're expecting to get from this degree. Like, oh, you're doing English Lit, what kind of job do you expect to get from that? That sort of shit. If you're in a place where the government pays your fees, is it not a waste of taxpayers' money? Or if you don't get your fees paid, is it worth going into huge amounts of debt for? And I remember my second day studying my politics undergrad, the lecturer spent ages talking about how good the department's graduate employment stats were, and student satisfaction by comparison was like a shadow of a thought. Education is seemingly not a place to expand your horizons or learn about who you are, what you find interesting, or even develop as a person. It's like a factory for producing the labour power that capitalism needs to keep churning. Lives commodified and experiences lost to the grind. So in this, another one of the shorter, more bloggy style videos is just to get a quick sort of look at how education is fucked. So when we talk about education becoming neoliberalised, what we mean is that it's becoming increasingly commodified and marketized. It's being reforged along an ideal to make students more productive workers, to squeeze out the most profit possible, whether by generating cheap labour power for capitalists to purchase or by commodifying students themselves. Now, this isn't a new phenomenon by any means. Remember the music video for Another Brick in the Wall, which, despite what a certain nostalgic critic might have you believe, isn't a shallow invocation of school sucking, but a condemnation of the cruel factory of education which focused on reconstituting class divisions within post-war Britain.
LOL, so school sucks. Grow a damn pair of balls.
I guess I can remember that, so the nostalgia critic doesn't have to. Yet today, the extent of the dominance of market forces within education which produce certain labour powers have only become more dominant. And we can track this to the change from public schooling to marketized schooling. And previously, school in the UK and many states like the US were largely public institutions. Now, this doesn't mean that they were free from any influence of the capitalist market forces, and far from it, as we can see if we remember the Wall.
It's all a part of a secret plan to make sure you're more likely to get a job when you're older.
But they were indirectly market mediated, meaning that their operations were still ultimately dictated by capitalist imperatives, but that they themselves weren't on the market. Today, however, one of the largest changes to schooling in the US and in England is the creation of chartered schools and academies, whereby schools are taken out of the state's hands and placed in the hands of private bodies who compete over students, over funds and over grades. In this sense, schooling is more directly market mediated. Education is a market. And in England so far, around 90% of schools are these private academy trusts, with the government aiming to have all schools academies by 2030. This doesn't necessarily mean that schools became fee-paying institutions, but that they are now placed directly in the market sphere, competing for funding, and like all capitalist enterprises, for growth. Children then are no longer just potential labour power to be produced, but they are themselves commodities. Their grades are used as evidence to get more funding from central government, and as evidence for the success of the academy to justify its expansion and to justify the CEO's salary, which can be upwards of £100,000 a year, which is mind-blowing. The primary motives of these schools then is to expand, to produce profit and to produce labour power. Not an ideal situation for ensuring children receive the best education or become, you know, just well-rounded people. When you're a commodity, your ability to become a well-rounded person is maybe inhibited slightly. And indeed, as academies have expanded ubiquitously across England, we've seen a return to what's been called by teachers I've spoken to as a Victorian teaching method. It's one which focuses on pushing kids through rote-learned exam factories, which ensure that children and their grades are easily quantifiable and measurable with the express purpose of making them into saleable commodities. The focus for kids is getting them through exams with the highest possible grades, and we've seen a grotesque example of this recently, with the government aiming to stop students who fail maths and English GCSEs from getting student loans to get into university, to crack down on so-called Mickey Mouse degrees and limit the number of students who are going into university. The justification being it's too expensive to the taxpayer, but also because you've got to produce these high grades for these academies. You've got to produce the right kind of labour power for the job market, the neoliberal job market. So Mickey Mouse degrees get axed, and we will return to this in just 1 second. And it's seemingly arbitrary that kids who fail maths and English GCSEs shouldn't be allowed to get student loans if they can get into university, until you consider all that context of the marketized neoliberal educational reforms. And it's here we can see some of the especially grim consequences of the drive to commodify education, the reproduction of racism and ableism as class relations within the school. In narrowly defining what's acceptable performance within schools and reorienting schooling along these market lines to be just about kids' grades, neoliberal education has become increasingly exclusionary. Racialised kids and disabled kids are among the most likely to be excluded from schools, in a trend which has only gotten worse as neoliberal schooling has become more embedded with academies and all that. For disabled children, this is but one early example of the segregation that's forced on them throughout society, as their exclusion from the labour market is translated throughout society and expressed within education as exclusion from schooling. Like, if your labour power is not being produced in a way that's appealing to capitalists, you're just excluded away from that. For racialised children who are disproportionately viewed as problems or challenging children who risk lowering schools' grades output, they're excluded first from the classroom and then from more broadly society, as they're placed into or forced into the school to prison pipeline. And in both cases, those children who are not producing the right grades for the schools to profit and who aren't proving that they're the ideal economic subjects who can find gainful employment after school, they're excluded from society and placed into necropolitical zones as social waste.
LOL, so school sucks. Grow a damn pair of balls.
Through this, schools have become a crucial site for the reconstitution of race and ableism as class within neoliberalism. But the school is not the only site of education which neoliberalism has sought to reforge, and in doing so, fucked up. The university has also moved from being indirectly market mediated to being more directly market mediated over the past 40 years. And one clear example of this is with the introduction of tuition fees in England, which has reformed the university not as a location for knowledge and human expansion, although it is debatable, I guess, how much universities were ever that. But under neoliberalism, they're purely reforged as a location of market exchange, where student consumers go into massive debt to buy the educational services from the university. Such services again are predicated on the promise of economic activity post-education, the promise of a job. If university isn't preparing you for the economic market, then you're not getting your money's worth, are you? Students are forced into this neoliberal political subject. They are being subjectified in this way. And it's something I've experienced myself. Like during the pandemic, working from home, rarely using university services, but paying a whole bunch of fees, I found myself bitterly thinking like, what the fuck am I paying for? And it's weird to catch yourself and sort of recognise the ways in which you're being subjectified in that way, because we shouldn't be viewing education as a service that we're paying for. We shouldn't be viewing ourselves as educational consumers. That's what they fucking want us to do. And yeah, let's not do that shit. But it's easy, it's the power of the sort of economic directives that we're under to that we catch ourselves caught in these thought loops. The reformation of the university along neoliberal ideals of the production of a specific kind of labour powers has also decimated the kind of education that you can get at universities. Across the UK, humanities departments are being closed. In the past year, 4 universities have closed history departments. My department, which focuses on post-colonial studies, was almost closed, with my specific human rights sub-department only safe because we were profitable, but only on the condition that we got moved to the legal department, which would have had a hugely constraining effect on the type of human rights research that was done in the department, an incredibly legalistic one, and if anyone knows my views on human rights, that's bad. It's a bad way to view human rights or research human rights. And it was only by a collective outcry that those plans were actually shelved by the university, and my department was thankfully saved. And just as I was writing this, like the day I was writing this, news emerged that several universities across the country announced that they're making entire humanities departments and social science departments redundant. A friend of mine at a different university told me about how half of the staff in his departments across the social science schools were being made redundant, and they were being made to reapply and recompete for their own jobs. And all the language of these redundancies was couched in terms like neoliberal terms on, oh, we've got to reforge these departments, refocus these departments for employer-led skills and to focus on vocations. And these cutbacks themselves are justified in reference to COVID as cost-saving measures, further evidence of the pandemic being used to further embed neoliberalism. It's really mad. Like, my friend who told me about this at his institution sent me a screenshot of how the university last week thanked all of the staff for their amazing efforts in research, for making them one of the best research universities in the UK, and 5 days later sent them all emails saying that half of them will be made redundant and they'll all have to recompete for their jobs again. It's fucking wild. And like, on top of this, during the pandemic, universities which were struggling were offered financial support on the conditions that they cut economically useless degrees in the humanities and the social science and instead focus on perceived economically productive and useful degrees in STEM, in science, technology, engineering and maths. Education reformulated along market ideals with the production of certain kinds of labour powers, not allowing people to expand their interests. And finally, it's not only in the provision of education that university has become neoliberalised, but in, as we've said, the conditions of work. The university and the school, for that matter, has become a site of increasing precariousness, precarity, where staff from academic to cleaning are placed in insecure and low-paid contracts. In the case of academic staff, this allows universities to force research into producing more and more research as a commodity to prove the value of the institution and attract more funding. If you don't produce enough, then your contract won't be renewed and you're fucking left with nothing. Staff are disciplined and the commodity of their labour power is cheapened. And I have heard horror stories, more horror stories than you can tell, from friends who are academics, where they've been paid like £600 for a term's worth of teaching. And the conditions for early career academics are just utterly horrendously bad. So, you know, sign up to my Patreon at patreon.com/JohntheDuncan for as little as $2 a month. It genuinely is really hard when you're a PhD student, final year PhD student, and you're trying to figure out where you want to go for your career. Like, I want to get into academia, not even for the research. I would love to do teaching, just be teaching staff in a university. But you see all this stuff, the precarity and the slashing of half of staff at universities across the UK, the incredibly low pay and insecure contracts, and you're just sitting there thinking like, is there anywhere for me? Am I like spending 3 years doing this thing that's going to get me nothing on the other end of it? It's quite an incredibly disheartening place to be in when you're just about to start looking for academic jobs. So, you know, again, patreon.com/JohntheDuncan. These conditions are not conducive to providing strong education for students. And it's not that many wonderful academics don't provide great education. They do, but they do so despite the conditions of the university, not because of it. And also just, again, want to highlight, pre-neoliberalism, the university wasn't an ideal site. There are many problems deeper than this, but this is the sort of sharp end of the fucking sword? I don't know. This is the sharp edge of a stick that they're poking us with, the sort of neoliberalised aspects of it. From school through to the university, neoliberalism has increasingly fucked education. Whether by turning students into commodities and excluding those who challenge commodification, or by turning the university into a site of job preparedness where everything is defined by its relation to the market. Neoliberalism has sought to produce a particular kind of political subject with particular kinds of labour power, and in doing so has excluded students, lowered the quality of education, and disciplined staff to cheapen their labour. This is but a glimpse of the dogshit world that I'm doing so much work, desperately doing so much work to try and get into, because for some reason I like reading, writing and teaching about shit. So, you know, again, patreon.com/John. Ring that bell, like and subscribe. Hey! Oh, I'm bad at that. 3 years, you'd think I'd be better at that by now. But I haven't even scratched the surface of the ways in which education is exclusionary, patriarchal, ableist and racist, or how universities are embedded in global imperial value chains by forming investment partnerships with oil companies or arms companies like eBay. This is just a glimpse at the many, many ways in which education is fucked. So in the spirit of trying to keep these short, I guess, here's the Patreon thanks. If you pay £10 a month, I thank you on Patreon. Here are the £10 a month Patreon shoutouts. Austin Talman, Robin, Rachel Mixon, Rich, Niels Applegard, Dinfall Pancakes, Kieran Gore, like a ghost, Atticop, Joel, Daniel Hughes, Tamash Kispiter, Paul Singleton, and that's it. That's all of the $10 ones. If you want your name shouted out, you can get $10 on the old Patreon, and that's one of the many benefits, I guess. Yeah, cheers for watching. Trying in vain to keep these relatively short. We'll see how that continues to go. Yeah, bye. Love you all. Love you.